So we're going to talk about rules for writers and whether we actually follow them or should follow them, and basically whether they are meaningful or not. And the first rule up is writing what you know.
So I came up with this because I came up with this idea to start talking about some of these things because you and I are both on Twitter. And I think, we see a lot of what goes on in Twitter in the writing community space. And one of the things that I hit my head against the wall about are the absolutes that I see other writers put out there. And I don't know if you see that or what you think about that. But there are a few that we're going to talk about. Writing what you know is one of them. My personal perspective on that is, as most of these rules are, it's extremely limiting. And it eliminates the consideration of your imagination. I don't, writing what you know, well, that means that I would have to write stories about a 55-year-old man who's an attorney who used to work for the state of California. And there's other things, but you've read almost everything I've written and published. Vast majority of it is not what I quote unquote know. It's what I can come up with in my imagination. I actually had a back and forth with someone on Twitter last week about this very thing, and I said, we talked in the last conversation you and I had about the Marfa Lights and Shady Acres. Shady Acres, the main character, is a 100-year-old man. I'm not 100 years old. I don't know anybody who's 100 years old. It's been decades since I've been in a senior citizen, convalescent facility. I used my imagination. Marfa Lights is about a 14-year-old, I think he's 14 years old, a boy who has cerebral palsy and is wheelchair bound. I've never known anybody like that. I did sit next to an older person in his 20s who had cerebral palsy and was wheelchair bound when I was in law school. But, I've never been to Marfa, and the story takes place in Marfa. So anyway, I think one of the things these rules do is actually serve to limit writers rather than expand what writers do. So that's my initial thought on this one.
My thought is I basically agree with you on this, that it's extremely limiting to say to somebody, write what you know. I think I know where that rule comes from, which is when they're trying to prevent people from writing about stuff that they just have no clue about. I'm trying to think of a good example of something like that. Once in a while, you'll see this especially in like historical fiction, where somebody will just write something that makes, absolutely no sense, completely anachronistic. But to me, the solution to that is not to say, okay, only write about what you know, because, you, Berthold, Gambrel, are a 30-year-old office drone. No, nobody wants to read that.
Right.
The proper way to respond to that is, okay, expand what I know. If I want to write about some period in history, I have to learn about it first.
Right.
So I think I understand the intent behind the advice, but I think there's a better way to frame it as like, make sure you know what you're talking about.
Well, right, and that's one of the things that I think a lot of these rules are stated in a way that seem like they're absolutes, and there's a better way to say them to the extent that writers need rules. And I think what you write, generally, for the most part, is a perfect example. Virtually no human being on Earth knows anything at all about interplanetary travel or space or, whatever. You're making stuff up. You don't know what it would be like to travel in a spaceship to another planet, or what's the thing you have in the directorate? I'm trying to remember. It's almost like a space elevator or something like that.
Oh yes, the space elevator.
Have
Yes.
you ever been on a space elevator?
Mm, no, I'm pretty sure I have not.
So how do you know that? How do you know what it's like to be on a space elevator, right?
Exactly. You just make it up.
Well, that's the thing, is it's like, with especially science fiction and fantasy are, to me, the best examples of how this rule doesn't necessarily work the way people say it. No, no living human being, in fact, no human being ever has experience with dragons. And
Exactly.
yet, how many fantasy books have been written with dragons? How did J.R.R. Tolkien write about the desolation of Smog? I don't know if that's the way to pronounce it, but in The Hobbit, there's a dragon. How did J.R.R. Tolkien know anything about dragons? Dragons have never existed. So anyway, um, I think you're right about what it really is make sure you know something about what it is you're going to write, but write what you know is just, I I don't I don't get that. And the other thing to me is, as we discussed last time, part of writing is the challenge of writing something new, writing something that isn't me, and using my imagination. And people who write a lot of science fiction and fantasy, they talk about world building, right?
Yeah.
World building. Well, in some respects, that's every single piece of fiction, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, literary fiction, uh, legal thriller, horror story. It's world building. You're building a world in which your story works. So
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that write what you know is just it's just the exact wrong way to phrase it. Yeah. It and interestingly, I think you could even argue it can lead to um, fiction that's actually uh, worse than it would have been otherwise, because people will think, well, I'll try to just insert myself into this story and basically make it me, and that makes it a
right,
very um, limiting thing
right.
if you just do that.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, it's also, fiction is fiction. It's not real. It's meant to kind of stretch the boundaries, and if the only people who write medical thrillers are doctors, or the only people who write uh, fictional sports stories are people who played the game, those stories are only going to have like one kind of take on it. Whereas someone who didn't necessarily ever play football, writing a fictional take on football, it could be something completely different than someone who played the game. And it doesn't make it wrong if the person never played the game but wrote a story based around football.
That's a great point. Yeah, because if somebody has done it, they might be too limited to sort of think outside the box in terms of what can be done with this. They might, well, this is how it's done, so that's how it
Yeah.
works, and that's it.
I'm actually in the middle of reading a manuscript for someone. It's a baseball novel, and it's clearly written by someone who has been a baseball fan, and I know that he's been a baseball fan his entire life. But there are things in it that someone who really knows the game and knows, the minor league baseball system, and how all these different teams and things interact with each other will say, well, that's not right. That's not how it really is. But guess what? It's fiction. It doesn't have to be. So I'm going to give him a lot of comments back about some things that he did, and kind of, yeah, it's not really like this. Um, and it's up to him what he wants to do with it, because it's fiction. It doesn't fiction does not have to track with exactly what real life is in whatever environment the story is supposed to take place.
So I think we can agree that we both think that write what you know is just, it's not the helpful advice.
I think we're going to agree on everything in this call.
I think probably yes. So I guess we should have gotten a contrarian on here to just disagree.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, it's an incentive for more people to participate.
Yeah, there you go.
So we move on to pantsing versus plotting, which is one I would almost say, I guess I've never known exactly where you draw the line between the two, to be honest with you.
If you had to say, I, Berthold Gambrel, am what would you say you are?
I would say I'm a pantser.
Okay. Do you use Scrivener?
No.
Do you use any kind of tools to help you organize your stories and outline things? And
I might on occasion use an outline tool, or more likely what I'll do is just pull up a Word document and like fill out sort of chapter by chapter. I'm like, broadly speaking, this happens in chapter 1, this happens in chapter 2, etc. Although I'm not necessarily constrained by that. It's funny, I was looking today at the document that was the start of Vespasian Moon's Fabulous Autumn Carnival, and I did that, but there were plenty of times where as I'm writing it, I was like, I don't like that. I'm going to go in a different direction. This is just go somewhere else.
Do you ever think that your writing suffers because you're not a plotter or an outliner, or you don't plan the whole thing out before you sit down and write?
No. The only time I've been worried about that, I guess, was with the Lurge Robot Factory adventure, where because it's a mystery, and a mystery has to have a tight plot that makes sense. I was like, am I going to regret that I didn't plot everything here out meticulously? I had a general idea in mind, but I was worried about it, but in the end, it seemed to turn out okay.
Did you, because you published a chapter every Saturday for a couple of months, did you start publishing it before you had finished writing it?
It was about 90% done, and I mean all the way through. There were a few minor edits. Actually, I should correct that. It was more like 95%. I made a few minor tweaks along the way, but it was basically done before I published the first chapter.
Okay. So, I want to make clear on this particular one, and actually all of these things. Nothing that I'm saying or you're saying or anything we're saying here should be viewed by anybody who actually watches this at some point in the future as being, you can't do it this way, or you shouldn't do it this way, or whatever. If you're comfortable writing what you know, good. That's what you should write. If you're comfortable being a plotter, that's what you should be. If you're comfortable being a pantser, that's what you should be. But where it gets, again, where it becomes an absolute, in this particular one, I never knew anything about pantsers or plotters. I never heard that phrase until I saw it on Twitter earlier this year. And suddenly that became a thing. All the people in the writing community, are you a pantser? Are you a plotter? You're a pantser, blah, blah, blah. And at one point I saw someone who, in his profile, claimed to be a writer and an agent. And I don't remember who he was an agent for, or he worked with a publishing company or something. And he tweeted, there is no such thing as a pantser. And if someone really is a pantser, they're a horrible writer. And it's like, okay, come on, really, seriously? That's the thing. Again, these writing rules. Everybody has what works for them. I am totally and entirely a pantser. I don't, other than, some thoughts that I have in my head about what I think the story is going to be about, I just start writing. And as I write, things open up, and more outline details are in my head, but I almost never write down an outline. At some point while I'm writing a longer piece, I might have another document or a page at the beginning of the story that are my notes, things that I want to keep track of and make sure that I address at some point in the story. Like in The Dime, the very beginning, Lily, the older of the three characters, talks about going to the lake with her sketch pad. And then later on, much later on, I realize I never talked about the sketch pad again. And maybe that, why bring that up if it never comes up again? So I made a note to address that, or some interactions with other characters. Other than that, I just write the story and see what happens. So I'm totally a pantser. I don't have any problem with people who are plotters or pantser plotters or plotter pantsers. Whatever it is that works for people, that's what they should do.
And so let me ask, is that holds true even for One Night in Bridgeport?
Well, so one night, again, mentally, I discussed last time that when I got the idea and I was driving home that night, I outlined it in my head, the bare bones of the story. That's all I did. I didn't go home and write an outline or write, the chapters and what would happen in each chapter. I just started writing it and see where it took. Just saw where it took.
I see. Yeah, because that's one, since it's like a legal thriller, I could see like, oh, maybe you need to have certain plot outlines, but you just did it in your head, just like me and my mystery
Yeah.
story. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, the thing about that is I can say that I outlined it, but in the story, there's a twist
Mm-hmm.
at the end. I had no idea that was coming until I got to that point.
Oh wow.
So, I mean, I might be overstating that a little bit, but there came a point at which, okay, how am I going to end this? I need to, come up with something. And there's a number of things in that story that they were not, and they're big things in the story, like the twist at the end. I didn't have that twist in my head at the outset.
Wow.
The outline in my head, was Jack goes up to Bridgeport. He's there for work. He sleeps with Leah. He realizes he's made a huge mistake. He races home, doesn't even say goodbye to her. She wakes up, and then there's the whole interaction with Butkus, and he convinces her that there's something horribly wrong here. And so she says, yes, he raped me. And then what happens after that? That's the process of writing for me.
That is really cool. See, I would not have guessed that. Like if you asked me to imagine how you came up with that, I figured, oh, he probably had this whole thing set up in the beginning.
No, no. And I mean, it's same thing with Irreparable Past. I knew I wanted to write a story about an older man who's living alone and why he got there. I didn't necessarily know how it was going to end when I started it. I just started writing it. And all I'm going to say to people is, yes, pantsers exist.
So on this, let me sort of play devil's advocate for a minute and suggest that if you are writing a story I don't really want to say in a genre, because I don't want to suggest this is true of like all genre fiction, but if you are writing to meet, say, a specific formula,
Yeah,
do you think then that might be a reason why, for example, somebody who is an agent would say, oh, you should be a plotter because you'll never be able to hew to a formula if
could
you're
be.
a pantser?
Yeah, could be. And the other thing is, people who write fantasy or science fiction, like I said, there's world building involved in that. That requires some level of plotting and planning and organization. So yes, again, depending on what you write, how you write, there is some, plotting works for some people. It may even be required. Make sure you fit the formula.
Like when Stephen King writes a book, does he just say, okay, there's definitely going to be a part where they go to Derry because everyone must go to Derry in a Stephen King book?
Yeah, well, and there's also going to be that one kid who has some kind of weird mystical powers that, figure everything out. And then there's always going to be the old guy who also has some weird mystical powers that gets hooked, connected to the kid, and somehow they solve everything and save the world.
So yeah, again, I think we're in agreement here that being a pantser does not make you less of a writer, and being a plotter does not make you less of a writer. It's just whatever works for you.
Yeah.
So now we come to, well, in our case, it would be men writing from the female perspective. We could also use this to address, we could broaden it to say just writing from a perspective that is not yours. I guess we'll start with the narrow one of the experience of writing as a male from the perspective of a female.
Sure. And you have written a number of stories from the perspective with a female narrator.
Yes.
I think you actually, it seems like most of your stories.
Many of them have female protagonists. Now, some are written in the third person, so they, I'd say close third person, so it sort of feels like a narrator.
Yeah.
It's still detached. The House of Teufelwelt I wrote from a female perspective, and I wrote it more or less deliberately to see if I could write a female perspective in a manner that was convincing and that worked.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say I have no issue with people writing from as a man writing from a female perspective. I would just say make sure you have female beta readers.
Yes.
Run it, just run it by them, and because there were certainly things in early drafts of that women read that and were like, no, this has to be changed.
Well, it's funny because when I think, I've told you when I wrote Bridgeport, it took me a year to write it, and it was in first person from Jack McGee's perspective. And there's a huge difference between the first draft and the second draft, besides just switching from first person to third person. But one of the things that after I wrote it, I had my mom and dad read it, and my dad referred to it as a very misogynistic story because all of the main women in it were essentially crazy. and I thought, yeah, you know what, Dad, you're right. And that was part of the rewrite, was to not turn all the women into crazy people. And so it's not exactly, writing from a perspective that isn't you, but it's still, writing realistic characters. And to me, again, going back to the challenge of writing, if all I ever did was write from the perspective of a 55-year-old white man, that would be boring. And part of the challenge is, okay, The Dime has 3 different narrators. 2 of them are girls, 20-year-old girl and a 16-year-old girl. And I'm extremely concerned that I get their reactions and their thoughts and their words accurate, but let's see how it goes.
Exactly. Yeah. You've got to me, it's about just trying to think about something from somebody else's perspective, put yourself in their shoes, and try to empathize with them and write it in a way that, is like, okay, if I were this person, how would I approach it? And try to convincingly portray that. And I think I certainly have seen on Twitter, people will just say things like flat out, men should not write women ever. and which I can't say I agree with that. What?
Well, and the other thing, and at the risk of getting political, although this isn't meant to be political, there's this whole thing going on out there about cultural appropriation, that white people can't write from the perspective of an African American, or someone who's not Chinese shouldn't be able to run a Chinese restaurant. Um, and I just think, again, that's so incredibly limited, to think that the only people who can write from the perspective of a disabled African American veteran is a disabled African American veteran, or the only people who can write from the perspective of a woman is a woman. I just, we should all, writers should be able and allowed, just like any artist, songwriters, painters, actors, actresses. Part of creativity is getting outside of yourself.
Exactly.
Right?
Absolutely. It's, I mean, one thing I can say for sure is that the first draft of Teufelwelt was written not from the perspective of a woman, but from the perspective of Roderick Teufelwelt, the main character, which, for a number of reasons, the book was much less good that way, because it gave certain things away very early on. So
Yeah.
I feel that it works much better written from that perspective. And so if something is better that way, you shouldn't, as a writer, you should say, I'm going to go for that. Now, again, I mean, I make the point of, yes, if I, just gone with my first draft, I could see people going, wow, this guy doesn't know how to write women. What's wrong with him? But, you just refine it and get feedback until you get it right.
Well, and you said something that I think is critical. You wrote it with one narrator and realized that wasn't the best way to tell the story. So you changed who the narrator was. You didn't care that that meant the narrator was a woman. And it goes back to what I believe is the only rule in writing. And I think I talked about this last time. Write a good story. And if the way to write a good story is a female character, even though you're a male, then give it a try. Again, it's like Shady Acres has a number of different characters, a number of different narrators. None of them are me, but that's what the story required.
Exactly.
The 100-year-old man, Mike, and the nurse, and some of the others. It's what does the story require? So.
Exactly. And I think maybe this goes back to the first point about writing what you know, which is like, I think this advice of don't write from, a perspective other than your own. What people are trying to say with that advice is don't write from a perspective of ignorance. Don't just try to write somebody without putting any thought into it. Because I can understand how that, and there are certainly many examples out there of men trying to write women and writing them in a just hilariously bad way.
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, don't do that. But the solution to that is not don't write women, but just think about it. Then that's really the key.
Yep, I agree.
And I think you can broaden this in a number of ways, to all sorts of different perspectives. And because I think absolutely that's one that got to be willing to try and experiment.
Are there any other rules we have?
Well, I don't know if this is a rule, but it's something that's bothered me for a while. So I'm going to bring it up, which is I hear more and more this idea that a story should start out with a bang or some sort of exciting sequence that really grabs the reader right off the bat.
Yes.
I've always been skeptical of this because Well, the example I always point to is Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskervilles, one of the most famous detective stories ever. Starts off with Holmes and Watson talking about a walking stick that they're looking at and inspecting. Is like the most dull way to start off a story, yet
Hmm.
it seems to have worked. Uh,
Yes, yes.
so
No,
I'm against this idea of yes, it has to start off with a bang.
so there's two things. One is a number of years ago, I forget who did it, but someone published the list of the best-selling novel each year for the last 100 years, and I decided I was going to try to read every single one of them. I only got through the first 4 or 5 years or so, but if you go back to novels that were published, 40, 50, 100 years ago, it's just completely different. The novels that I read from the beginning of that list, it they kind of start slow, very slow, and it isn't for pages and pages that something actually develops. And the thing that drives this idea is how agents and publishers select things. And I don't know if you've ever queried agents or publishers. Have you ever tried?
No, I have not.
Have you ever looked into it?
Not really. No.
They want the first 10 pages or the first two chapters or the first this or whatever. They don't want the entire thing. Plus, you have to write a query letter that grabs their attention and makes them want to read it. So, what you have to do is it's not actually about grabbing the reader's attention. It's about grabbing the agent or the publisher's attention. That's what it's about, because they get hundreds, thousands of queries every year, and they're not going to pick it up and ask for more unless what you write in that first page or the first 5 pages says, look at me, read me. And that just drives me crazy. On uh, with the dime, I'm going to try to get that traditionally published. But other people have told me they love the beginning, but I think the beginning is not very good, and I wonder if I'll have any success because they'll read the first couple paragraphs and say, okay, where's the excitement? Where's the drama? Because you gotta have it immediately. And one other thing, have you ever read The Kite Runner?
No, I haven't.
Um, it's a story about Afghanistan, novel about Afghanistan, written by a guy who used to live in Afghanistan. And I read it years ago, and after the first 25 pages, I just like, why am I reading this? This is not working for me. And I was this close putting it down, but I kept reading, and that became one of my favorite novels ever. And I just think if people have to be grabbed in the opening pages, and that's going to decide whether or not they read a book, who knows what they're missing out.
Exactly. Yeah. And I just don't I I just don't think it's true that readers read like that. Like you say, exactly. Agents absolutely are going to read like that, and to a degree they have to because, as you say, they get so much stuff. But I don't know that readers necessarily read that way. I think they want a good story, and if a good story is a thing that slowly builds up, then I think readers will be fine with it.
Yeah, yeah.
It does make me wonder, yeah, how many of these rules are actually rules for getting an agent to pay attention rather than rules for actually writing a good story.
Yeah. I don't know. I think in terms of within the writing community, it's also a way for writers to have some kind of certainty or comfort with what they're doing. I go back to that writing conference where I, you know, heard the best rule of all: there are no rules, just write a good story. And the way that that came up was there was a session that was a pretty large group, probably 100 people in the room, and the writer who was leading the discussion, I don't remember what the topic was, but he was talking several times during the course of the hour. This one particular woman would stand up and ask a question. And then the one question I remember is, I've been told that if you change the voice, it needs to be a new chapter. That you can't change the voice in the middle of a chapter or something. Now I'm trying to remember what my point was. Oh, I know. But I got the sense in this series of questions she asked throughout that hour that she was looking for confirmation. And I get that, because one of the frustrating things about writing is you do not get instant gratification as a writer. There's no such thing as instant gratification, especially if you're writing novels, because you're going to be writing a novel for months, sometimes years, and no one will be reading it, and you'll be thinking it's crap, and everything else, you're going to be doing everything you can to shut yourself down because it's horrible, and you don't get feedback, and so you need confirmation. Am I doing this right? Is this the way I'm supposed to do it? So I get that the rules can provide some comfort to people, but it's like we talked about. To me, they're limiting. And people should let their creativity, let their imagination go and write whatever story it is they want to write.
Exactly. It's funny you mentioned this about the changing the voice or changing like the perspective, and it has to be a new chapter. It so happens I'm reading right now. I'm reading the book Dune on the recommendation of Noah Goetz. Have you ever read it?
Dune?
Yeah.
You haven't read Dune before? Where the heck have you been? Oh my gosh. I read that probably the first, I don't remember when I read it for the first time, but that was one of those books that I read a number of times over the course of like a 5 to 10 year period. I absolutely loved that book.
I'm only like 40% in, and I'm loving it too. It's quite good. So yeah, I'm somewhat late to the party on this. I'm trying to read it before the movie comes out.
But so what about that related to the different
there,
voices?
there was a scene in it I was just reading where they're changing perspectives. I think within the same paragraph, it's like, oh, there's a dinner going on at Vito's, and like it's from Paul's perspectives, and then it's from Jessica's perspective in the next,
Yeah.
if not that paragraph, then the next paragraph. And I was thinking, like, gosh, this really seems to be violating a rule that I heard somewhere. And I was like, but it seems to have worked out okay.
But it's a really good story.
Exactly.
That's a good example of how a rule doesn't work in every situation when you're writing, because if you were to follow that rule in that setting, it's a dinner where all of these characters who have critical roles and have been, narrative voices elsewhere in the story suddenly are in this same setting. And what you want to know is what each of them are thinking and seeing and doing, right?
Exactly.
But are you really going to, in the context of just a dinner, are you really going to break that down into individual chapters? Right?
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, this works. So I'm glad he didn't follow that so-called rule.
Yep. Yep.
Um, Another thing, and again, I don't know if this is a rule, but it's something I've seen. Audrey Driscoll did a post about this a while back, and if I'd been thinking, I would have the post here to reference it, but I don't. But it's about cutting out just extraneous words from your text. Like had, I think, was the particular word she was saying that the thing was like, oh, you should not use the word had.
That.
that. There are some other ones I can't think of. What other? Yeah. Um,
I've heard I don't know I've heard, you know, there are writers who say that when they write and then they edit and they rewrite and they edit, it's like they pay attention to every single word. I can't do that. I can't. I just can't do that.
I have sort of a weird approach in that I try as much as possible to read stuff out loud,
Hmm.
and if I like the rhythm, it stays. And sometimes I find that adding an additional word that might be technically superfluous helps me with the rhythm. Now that could
Yeah,
just be me. Like I admit
yeah.
this could be irrational, but if I like it, I'll say that word stays in, even though it doesn't need to be there, just because.
So that's another rule I've heard is, you know, make sure that you read what you wrote out loud. And I've never done that. I trust my internal voice. So I never read it out loud, but I definitely, you know, am listening to it in my head when I write it and then when I read it later.
That I mean, and that works fine. I think it started for me as just a way of catching typos. I was like, because I got, and I still do this, I'm sure, but I found I reduce the number of typos if I force myself to read it out loud.
Yeah, yeah.
It's painful. Don't get me wrong. Oh my gosh, reading something out loud is um it's torture, but uh it is good for that. And yes, like there are some times when I'm like, this just works having this word here, which again, to go back to your point earlier, if you read novels from like 100 years ago or so, they're all they would all be called way too wordy.
I was just going to say they're extremely wordy. There was no such thing as a 60 or 70,000 word novel back then. Probably no such thing as a novel less than 100,000 words back then. Do you ever, when you read a book, do you ever look at the number of pages and then figure it's about, you know, 300 words per page? Wow, this is 180,000 words. How did they do that?
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, the old days, it was a different game.
Yep, yep.
I'm not sure that any of those things I've just mentioned were actually rules, but they were certainly things I've heard people say, and they annoy
I
me.
think
I don't know.
I think they fall into the category. Again, there are these ideas that people think this is how you're supposed to do it, and sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Like you say, it just comes back to just tell a good story.
Yeah,
I encourage, the people who watch this, I hope they will, like, if they have rules that they want, to give their opinion on, I hope they'll say something because I'm sure.
yeah. They want to talk about any of these things or other rules. We'd love to expand this conversation to include other writers.